A panel discussion this afternoon looking at the Royal Commission of Inquiry into child sex abuse, both in state care and in faith-based care as well. My guests on the program are individuals for whom this is part of their story. This is something which tragically happened to them as children, and they're also all participants who submitted their stories to the Royal Commission of Inquiry that was presented to the Governor-General recently. Joining me in the studio, Frances Tagaloa, kia ora, thank you very much for your time today.
Kia ora, Andrew. Good to be here.
And also joining us by Zoom from Christchurch, Jim Goodwin. Jim, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me.
And also from Tairāwhiti, Rupene Amato, thank you so much for your time today.
Kia ora. Thanks for having us.
Rupene, if I can start with you, take us back to a brief version of the circumstances that happened to you as a child, the circumstance where this abuse occurred.
First of all, thank you for having us. It's a really important topic that needs to be discussed, and I'm really grateful that we've had this opportunity. For me, I'm a survivor of abuse. It happened to me whilst attending a Catholic school in Wairoa, where I'm currently based, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And that went on for a few months before we spoke to parents. And then once we spoke to parents, then just like what usually happens in the Catholic environment, that priest was then there one day and gone the next.
Yeah.
Which left us a bit confused, but it would have been good to have some sort of support. But that's mine in a brief nutshell.
Jim, to you next. What's your story? What happened to you as a young man?
So I'm a farm boy from South Canterbury, and I was sent up here to Christchurch to a very exclusive boys' Anglican boarding school, which was a brutal place to be in. We were abused in many ways, physically, sexually, verbally, emotionally. Yeah, that's my story. I went to that school 1970 to 1974.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you able to talk to anybody about that? Were you able to, as a child, express what was happening,
No.
or did that come later as an adult?
No, it came as an adult. As a child, we had this thing about not telling stories on each other, and I was terrified that my abusers would actually kill me if they found out I'd gone to the staff.
Gosh.
I tried telling my parents, and they couldn't handle it. They shut me down pretty smartly. So it was 37 years before I could really tell anyone about it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, thank you for sharing your story, and I know that that all of you having the courage to tell your story, to bring this into the light, will make a difference. Well, we're hoping and praying it will make a difference for generations to come. Frances, what's your connection? What's your story here?
I'm a survivor of faith-based abuse. I went to a Catholic primary school, Sacred Heart Ponsonby.
Yeah.
And I was abused by Brother Bede, who was at the Marist Brothers Intermediate School next door.
Yeah.
He was a very popular teacher, really well known, and a paedophile.
Yeah.
You know, and sadly there are other little girls that were also abused by him over the years, and I can track over 15 years of abuse by that man.
What, again, was it a situation where as a child you were able to tell anybody what was happening?
No,
or?
not at all. I think because the trauma was so bad for me, I blocked it out of my memories. So I didn't remember it all until I was an adult. And then I started getting the flashbacks and the memories of what had happened, and had to face that trauma as an adult. You know, I think as a child I couldn't understand it. Possibly my brain couldn't handle it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I didn't tell anyone. I didn't, and then I blocked it out.
Yeah, it's a psychological survival mechanism in some ways.
Yeah, that's right.
Rupene, back to you for a moment, because I suppose you at least were able to tell your story as a child. You were listened to, you were believed, something was done. tragically, what was done was for the person that abused you was moved on to somewhere else. That abuse wasn't stopped, it was just relocated in some ways.
Yeah, that's correct. My abuser was named Father Fitzpatrick, and after I told my story at the Auckland Forum, um, discovered that he had gone on to other areas where he continued with the church. So I believe because of that behavior, there would be other victims of abuse at the hands of that particular individual. We were very fortunate as kids that we had the capacity to talk to each other during the intervals. And in one of the conversations, we started talking about what was happening to us when we were having one-on-ones with the particular priest.
Yep.
And we discovered that there was a group of us that were actually being abused by that priest through confessionals and through some educational programs. And when we realized that it was happening to us, we almost became our own support group.
Okay.
We would have been about 12, 13 at the time. And so for us being that young to actually come up with a plan and say, you know, this isn't good and we need to talk to our parents,
Yeah.
that was quite good. I didn't talk to my parents personally about it because of fear of being hit, because back then in those days, children were seen and not heard. And, you know, we're little kids against this big machinery that is the church, where lying is kind of a sin, and you know, back then the behaviors of our parents were, if you can't fix it, then hit it.
Yeah.
That's since changed, and I'm really thankful that that behavior's changed.
Mm.
But certainly for us, we were very lucky to have stopped it before the grooming became worse, because we feel that it had the potential to be worse. Wairoa's quite a town where poverty is quite prevalent in the town, and it's probably a good location for those who want to seek victims.
So, a support group amongst your peers, but was there any support from the school, from the church, from family through what you'd gone through?
No, it was really interesting because once we talked our truth, and like I said, the priest was there one day and then gone the next. There was no support for us, no updates, no police reports. It was just supposed to be brushed under the carpet. And I think people look at kids and think they're resilient, they'll get over it, their memories will fade. And I think that's the wrong way of thinking, because the impacts as an adult can be quite traumatic, and if not dealt with, it potentially leads kids into a darker direction that we don't want for our community or our kids.
Jim, just wanting to bring you in on this one. For you, my understanding is your experience was the abuse was happening by your peers at school, that the children at school were, if not the problem, then at least part of the problem. There wasn't necessarily a safe community within that school environment where you could support each other. In terms of how that unfolded, was there a place that you were able to get help, some people that could support you, some people that believed your story?
No, not at the time, not at all. Well, partly was because all of us were being bullied, at least, in some way or another. So the sexual abuse that was done to me was out of the ordinary, but it was sort of part of what was going on in the place at the same time. So we were all sort of victims at the same time.
Yeah.
So who do you talk to? You know, we sort of have each other's back, but when you're 14, 15, that you can't stand up against the machine. And the place was run on sort of power.
Yeah.
So from the staff down, We had prefects, we had boy caning, we had detentions. The whole thing was run on power over people, and the younger you were and the smaller you were, the more you were knocked around.
In terms of,
so there's no one there.
Yeah. In terms of your experience with telling your story in later years, especially your experience with the Royal Commission, how was that for you? In some ways, revisiting a very traumatic part of your life.
I've told my story a wee bit publicly before I went to the Royal Commission, and I did a private submission to Sir Annan, which was lovely. He was very, very gentlemanly about it, and left me in no doubt that he believed my story.
Yeah.
And then I did a public submission to the faith-based part of the inquiry, and was very, very well supported by the barrister who interviewed me, and wellness support, and I took my significant other up with me, and very well supported. And it was great to have the opportunity, but it took decades before I could tell my story.
Frances, for your own experience, this was a story which, in some ways, your mind didn't allow you to believe your own story in some ways, but I suppose putting the pieces together and then having the courage to say, hey, I'm going to tell this publicly and to be part of the Royal Commission. What was that experience like for you?
Being part of the Commission was something that I felt that I needed to do. It was the right thing to do. And being a Christian, I have a personal relationship with God, so I had prayed about it, and I felt this is what God wanted me to do.
Yeah.
So it was the scariest thing I've ever had to do. I had to appear at their Catholic hearing. I was the first witness in their Catholic hearing. We had spent months looking at my submission and the evidence that I was going to give. And leading up to that was actually very traumatizing as well, because the Maris brothers, although they were told not to contact me, they tried to contact me beforehand, and I felt quite threatened by that. So there was a lot going on, and telling your story, even though the Commission had put as much well-being and help and support in, it's still traumatic. You know, you do get re-traumatized. But I felt I needed to work through that and do it. And thankfully my husband was there, my family were there supporting me, and I needed that. But also I was just as horrified to hear some of the other stories. It was not only difficult to tell my story, it was difficult to hear other survivors telling their stories. And that's why it became the biggest Royal Commission of Inquiry that New Zealand's ever seen, because the scope was just huge. I don't think the Commission, I don't think anyone knew just how many survivors of abuse were out there and how many would come forward. I mean, we know that about 2,500 survivors came forward with their story. About 40% of those were faith-based survivors, and about half of the faith-based were Catholic. So there's a good section of faith-based survivors. And then the Commission themselves, they estimate that between 1955 and 1999, there are probably about 255,000 people who are abused in care.
Gosh.
And
some of those have never told their story.
That's right.
Yeah.
And some of them can't tell their story. Our most vulnerable people with disabilities who cannot communicate in a way that we'd understand, they've not been able to tell their stories. And much of the abuse was in those types of institutions that were looking after disabled people. I think of Maryland's, where they had 537 boys went through there, and they know that 117 were abused. Gosh. But a lot of those were boys that went there were non-verbal, or they couldn't communicate. So, you know, that's only the bottom of probably the number. You know, it's probably a lot more than that, which is horrific, even in itself, to think at least 1 in 5, probably 2 in 5 boys that went to that school were abused. And it was just a pedophile ring. Who would have known that such a thing would go on in New Zealand?
This is a difficult topic to talk about, but such an important one. And I'm just wanting to reiterate, guys, thank you so much for having the courage to share your story, to share it publicly, to share it with the Royal Commission, and to share it with us today. We appreciate that there is a cost in doing so, but we also hope and pray that there is a benefit from bringing this darkness into the light, where we can speak the truth and ask some pretty tough questions about what went wrong and how we can do better as a society, and perhaps in particular as a church community. Jim, wanting to get your thoughts on not just the Royal Commission process, but the recommendations. A lot of stories have been told. There's been a lot of submissions to the Royal Commission. But bringing this all together and taking some action, making some recommendations on how we can be better at this, how we can do things differently. What's your thoughts, Jim, on the recommendations?
There's about 187 last count that I know of the recommendations. So there's a whole lot of them. So asking me my thoughts, I could go on for some time.
We won't go through a whole through all of them, of course. But is there any standout that come to mind? Is there any where you think, gosh, I'm glad they're addressing this aspect of it? Any standout points, Jim?
Standouts, I think, would probably be the Dilworth law.
Yeah.
So the Dilworth people made a very forceful submission to the Commission asking for mandatory reporting. So in each of our, we're a case where an institution knows that someone's been abused, it must be reported. And I think if that goes through, that would be great. There's lots about keeping of records. One of the problems that survivors have had is they've tried to find out what happened to them, what was recorded. No records.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it was the Catholics in Dunedin, someone deliberately burnt their records.
Yeah.
So that would now be cause a lot of trouble for that person. There's so many of them.
I think
I guess the
redress
the
design,
main
Jim.
thing that would be, Frances, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I think the recommendation that the independent redress design be put in place, the independent redress system, like the Commission actually made that recommendation in their interim report 2 years ago, and really was seeking for the government to put that in place before the Commission ended, and the government has not yet done that. We're still waiting. We are hopeful that it's going to happen, but it's needed for sure.
Rupene, your comments and thoughts on things that stand out from the recommendations, things that might have made a difference for kids like you back in the day?
Yeah, for me, it would have been good to have like an independent governing body that was established to ensure that our tamariki were put into safe environments. And also just in regards to the redress, a lot of survivors, they just want acknowledgement of actually what happened to them and an apology. An apology goes a long way. And it also helps survivors heal, and it helps them move on. And it also helps them with their relationships with the Lord, with Jesus.
Yeah.
It's just some simple things that our survivors require so that they are noticed and that they're seen, and that the church will actually acknowledge and do something to make sure it doesn't happen in the future.
I mean, an apology is a great place to start. Recognition that that this harm was done, but in terms of recommendations for reparations, for not just acknowledging what was done was wrong, but supporting people with their continued recovery and restoration, should that be part of the picture?
Definitely.
Absolutely.
I just think churches need to support that. You know, so many of our survivors have not been able to move forward or have impacts in their life physically, you know, that they need help with, as well as emotionally, whether it be counselling. Some cannot work, like the trauma and pain of their abuse lives with them every day, and they just cannot work because of that, and they need help to do that. And I think the church should be part of helping survivors do that.
Yeah. And this is criminal activity that we're acknowledging that wrong and evil has happened in this case. as a society, we should be asking questions about, so not just, hey, we never want it to happen again, sure, but what can we do to restore the lives and the hearts and the health of people who have been harmed by the system, I suppose.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. The irony is that the churches all preach that they are doing good and they want to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And these things are not only illegal by New Zealand law, but they're wrong by God's law. And they're happening in these institutions, which are supposed to be spreading the word of God.
Yeah.
It's they've got to sort themselves out.
And I think that's why we need an independent system, not just redress, but also, as Rupene was saying, it needs to be an independent system that's monitoring all our institutions, state and faith-based. What are the standards across the board for all our institutions? Because right now, our children and our vulnerable are at risk.
Yeah.
There's not the adequate provisions in place. Nobody's monitoring if people have standards. Now, I know churches do their best and they do what the law is required as much as they can, but what that is at the moment still is not going to protect our children and vulnerable. And so we need a system that is going to do that. You know, we have WorkSafe that protects our employees, but we don't have a safeguarding body that will protect all people, vulnerable and children. And I personally think that's something we need, that can monitor these and help our churches, help our institutions understand the standards that are needed.
The thing which really bothers me the most about this is, and look, abuse of children, regardless of the context, is an absolutely abhorrent and awful thing. But that this happened in religious organisations, and Jim, to your point, that these are, I would hope, the members of society that would understand this, would understand the difference between good and bad, between positive influence and evil, that the church not only has got this so spectacularly wrong, but has been so inept in processing and dealing with this over the years, is a shame upon the church and the institutions represented by it. So I think as a Christian community, we need to do better at this. We can't just say, hey, back in the day, gosh, wasn't it terrible, these bad things happening? Because tragically, it's still happening in our churches.
It's still happening, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I'm wanting to come back in just a moment because this is a dark subject, but actually, let's see if we can find some hope in this, because as a community, as faith communities, and as a society, we just need to be better at something so basic and fundamental as caring for children. The Royal Commission has concluded. It has been presented to the Governor-General. There'll be a response from the government and no doubt from church leaders in the weeks coming up. Frances, starting with you, how do you feel the church should respond? What would you hope church leaders would do in response to this report?
My hope is that church leaders would respond saying that they would support the recommendations, all the recommendations, that because by saying that, they're actually saying we support survivors and we want to see these recommendations put in place. And, you know, that concept of putting others first, you know, putting survivors first needs to be in the plan. That's what I would like to hear. I'd like to hear the churches saying that and wanting to be a part of whatever comes, the independent redress system, whether there is a safeguarding monitoring body, you know, wanting to be a part of that and supporting it and doing that from the front, like from their churches. I'm not hearing that. I'm not hearing, as a survivor, I'm not hearing that, but as a churchgoer, I'm not hearing our pastors and ministers saying, we need to get behind this. This is wrong. I'm not hearing them as horrified as I am that this would happen. And we need to make a change because they do have the power to do that.
I think there's a tendency for people in these situations to go into damage control mode, to throw up excuses or to say, oh, that was something which happened back in the day. Oh, isn't it terrible what happened to those people? But we're not part of the problem, and to not own responsibility as a community. Jim, what would you say to people who are thinking, hey, yes, this is terrible, but we're not part of the problem here, particularly talking to leaders of the faith community?
The abuse that's happened to people within New Zealand, it affects every one of us. You know, there's so many survivors. We're all affected by it. We're all connected to each other and we're all affected by this. I want to say to the churches, get rid of the expensive lawyers
Yeah.
and spend your money and your time on supporting survivors and on making sure that the abuse doesn't happen again. Yeah, there's been far too much time and money being spent on lawyers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it is an important point because, I mean, for your circumstances, each of you individually, this is something which did happen back in the day. And as we mentioned earlier, these were difficult times and there was corporal punishment and it was a different society. But let's be open and honest. Sexual abuse is continuing to happen in church schools and in church environments today. This week. It is still something which needs to have a light shined on it, to be open and honest about what is evil and broken within our communities, not just to seek, to be too quick to seek forgiveness, but actually to own the harm that has been caused. I mean, as we're wrapping things up here, Rupene, when it comes to survivors, because I also appreciate that there'll be people listening to this program today, this is part of their story as well, except unlike you brave people, they've never talked to anybody about what happened to them, but they're still carrying that hurt and that wound. Perhaps they'll be encouraged by what they're hearing today. Perhaps they will be emboldened to bring this into the light. What would you say to a fellow survivor to help them on their healing journey, to help them find their way back again?
I would say to them, you're not alone. There are others out there who will be happy to support. Make sure you do have a loving, healing support network around you. People will understand a lot more than you think they'll understand. And I think that once you share that story with your loved ones, you'll find that they'll be more compassionate, more empathetic, more supportive, and probably just as angry that they weren't aware of it while it was happening as well. And frustrated that nothing was done or no voice was heard.
Yeah.
And I would recommend that they find help, and there is help around, um, and there is support there, and just like you said, bring it from the darkness to the light. And that's how it should be. And the church should stand up, acknowledge what's happened, and just get on with the business. You know, it doesn't take much to forgive, and that's what they teach us. So, in a way, they need to forgive themselves and actually move on and help those who are survivors and put mechanisms in place to prevent it from happening. It's not that hard. There are resources out there to help.
Yeah. When it comes to the help, Jim, just your comments on this as well. Finding a way back to wholeness and healing. I know tremendous harm has been done, and for some people that full restoration and wholeness will never happen. But for you, Jim, is that possible? You can be whole once again when you address the issue, when you're open and honest about what happened.
Well, you'll never go back to how you might have been if the abuse hadn't happened. You'll turn out as a different person, whatever happens. I would say to people, go to where the love is.
Yeah.
It might be a support group. It might be whānau, as Rupene talked about. It might be finding a church that is welcoming. But go to where the love is. That's where the healing happens. It might be with a counsellor, a good therapist, but go to where the love is.
Frances, just wanting to a final word to you on this one, in terms of restoration and hope. Now, this is a dark picture that we've been painting, and it is significant shame to those of us who call ourselves Christians, who are part of the body of Christ in Aotearoa. But what can we do? What would be the ideal response And can we create a society where this type of stuff doesn't happen anymore? As we say, look, we've addressed it for many years. We're doing what we can to put safeguards in place. You mentioned people are doing their best. Honestly, it seems that doing our best isn't good enough. Can we, as a church community, get to a space where actually if this happens at all, it is very rare and it is addressed quickly, and we can create a society where this isn't happening as prevalently, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm really hopeful that that can happen. And I believe that this final report, although it's difficult to read and hear those horrific stories, the recommendations give us a way forward, a pathway forward of how we can have the Aotearoa that we need and that we want, that would actually protect our children and protect our vulnerable.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm very hopeful that if these recommendations are all applied, then we will get to that part. And our churches and our schools and our institutions will be safe places. At the moment, they're not.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in all the stories. And there's more stories to come.
Yeah.
There'll be difficult stories to hear. But I just want to encourage people to hear them, to feel that anger, that it's a just anger because it's wrong.
Yeah.
But then we can go forward. We can do something about it by supporting these recommendations and ensuring our government is going to be able to put those into place. Because thankfully, Jim, Rupene and I, we've had the privileged position of being a part of the report, and we've given input into it. And so we know that it is a really good report. We know if that was implemented, those recommendations were implemented, we definitely have a safer Aotearoa.
Yeah. Guys, thank you so much for sharing your story, for all of your contributions today. Just in summary, just wanting to emphasise that this isn't something which just happened to somebody else. This isn't something else which just somebody else did. That if as a society, particularly as a faith community, we're wanting to make the world a better place, then all of us need to own the darkness within our communities. All of us need to take responsibility for making our communities, our churches, our schools safer places for innocent children. We need to own that responsibility and not just do what is legally required of us, but go above and beyond to love and care for children the way Jesus has taught us to do. Guys, thank you so much for your bravery, for your wisdom, for sharing your stories with us today. Thanks very much for being on the program today.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate you.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Andrew.
it.